So I'm going to go over mitigation projects. Eric briefly went over plans. Projects can be a bit more involved than plans are, and there's a lot more options as to what actually is an eligible project. Eligible activities for a project. This list is not exhaustive. We do in this state submit a lot of projects to FEMA where they're like, well, we don't do that. And we have to say, well, no, it's not that you don't do that. It's not, there are some forbidden projects or forbidden activities that are not eligible, but we have a lot of projects that don't, they're not ineligible, but they're not listed in the eligible activities. So a lot of it is, it's not that you don't do that, you just haven't done it before. If you have one of those projects, we're always looking to kind of submit those to FEMA. So if it doesn't fall exactly in these categories, talk to us about it. We just may have to do a little bit more convincing or a little bit more educating to FEMA about what the project is and why it's important and how it's beneficial. So we have this one, I've got some slides on here where I go into more detail about some of this. Acquisition, as Rick knows, is a bit more of a complicated application process. In general, when you apply for a project, you don't have to have all of your engineering exactly done. You kind of need to know what you want to do, an estimate of the cost, put some of that in there, but you can still do some of the engineering and a lot of that detailed stuff after you're awarded the grant. When it comes to acquisitions, there is a lot of work and a lot of build-up to doing the application. It's a voluntary thing. If you're buying properties to remove them, either from a flood area or a landslide, the people have to be willing to participate. You have to do a lot of public notices and a lot of work before you even apply for the grant. So if you're interested in any type of acquisition, talk to us so we can make sure you can get all that stuff done before you put the application in. Because if any of that information is missing from the application, they won't accept the application as a complete project. And so you'll probably have to wait another year to do it. But you can do structural demolition and structural relocation. So if you're buying up homes or structures, could be a public building, you can either tear them down or move them. But an acquisition means you're then making that space open space, and it has to be in perpetuity. So from the time you buy it, you then have to maintain it. We have to come out every couple of years and monitor it, make sure it stays open. Flood mitigation, FMA is one avenue. So Brad mentioned that might be a good project for FMA. But PDM also has flood mitigation. If it's flood, it doesn't have to go under FMA. There are lots of flood projects we do under PDM. So localized and non-localized flood risk reduction. I'll get into a little bit more about that later. They have some things on that. Structural elevation, we don't really do that a lot here. That happens a lot more in coastal regions or regions where they have lots of storm surges or river rises. If a home's already existing, they can like elevate it above. That's why you see all the nice beach houses up on sticks. Dry flood proofing, that's something that we can do in some instances here. I know Kathy, our floodplain administrator, is trying to deal with some industrial buildings that were built where they shouldn't have been, and so in order to become compliant, they have to dry flood proof. And that basically means you leave the building where it is, but you have to flood proof it so that the water won't infiltrate it and all of that kind of stuff. Retrofit, so there's structural, non-structural, and now there's a new category of infrastructure retrofit. So structural and non-structural, Brad mentioned a little bit of this. Structural is you are actually retrofitting the building, the foundations, the walls, the roof, the ceiling. You're bracing that to withstand earthquake shaking. So you're actually getting in the walls, getting in the foundation, doing the building. Non-structural is like the example Brad gave. They were strapping pipes so that in the event of an earthquake, those things weren't. Non-structural that you would do in your home would be like strapping your water heater to the wall, tying your bookcases to the wall. That's kind of the non-structural retrofitting. It's things within the building that you're retrofitting and bracing so that they don't create problems. And then infrastructure, they now talk about, there wasn't a lot of detail in there, but I think we can do some bracing of infrastructure. We'll have to look more into detail though. But if you have like an infrastructure system, I know we retrofitted a water tank for one of the water districts. Part of that was they had to reconfigure how the pipes from the ground coming into the building were situated so that they didn't have breakage there. And so that's probably part of their infrastructure retrofitting is tying those pipes into the buildings. Wind retrofit. This is more common in hurricane prone areas, but we do get high winds here. I'm not sure if we would have any projects that would need to qualify for this. It generally tends to be homes that are damaged. But if you happen to have something, you live in a wind tunnel in a canyon or something and want to retrofit some stuff, let us know. Generally, the wind retrofit is a program for 1 and 2 family residences. Specifically talks about that. We might be able to do public buildings, but we'd have to look into that. And then generators. So generally, if you're doing a generator, it can't be a standalone project. In general, it has to be part of a larger project. So if you're installing a generator and its connection components as part of a larger scale project that you're doing, they were eligible. Recently, they started now making exceptions with standalone. It can be a standalone project. Your project can be purchasing a generator, but it has to be a generator for a critical facility. Your EOC, I think we've done them for like water pump stations, things like that. So if you want to do a generator, it does need to be for a critical facility in your community. It can't just be a generator for school. As much as we love schools, they're not necessarily critical facilities. So, and then soil stabilization, it's protection against erosion, and it has to protect structures or infrastructure. One exception I guess it fell under was landslide stabilization. It was protecting homes and other things around it that was part of a property acquisition. But if you want to do soil stabilization, and then wildfire mitigation, defensible space, Brad mentioned an eligible activity is clearing shrubbery and other things to create a defensible space, fuels reductions, and ignition resistant construction. I don't believe we've done any grants on that. It's listed in there. It's utilizing on existing or buildings where you put in, if you have a building that's, I guess, really risk for wildfire or other situations, using specific types of special fire resistant materials. And then others, we mentioned this briefly, if you have ones that address climate change, adaptation, and resiliency, there are, and I can't remember if I put it in another slide, but there are projects, and it's a new one that's on priority now, and I think it's on my priority slides, is that they're looking at doing aquifer recharge. So that's a project that you can look into. It's getting grant funding to recharge, refill aquifer systems, which is a great drought mitigation strategy. It's also a great strategy to help with other issues because aquifer drainage causes more than just loss of water. When aquifers are empty, water is buoyant. It has pressure, it keeps the ground up. Once you lose that water, it's air, which is not, and the ground starts to compact. We do have some communities that are now having lovely little sinkholes or foundation problems because they were built on top of aquifers, which are not full anymore, and the ground is compacting. So it's a mitigation strategy, not just for having water storage, but for some of those other issues we face. I think I read a study a year or two ago when they talked about California, because it's been in drought for so long, and they had massive rains a few years ago, and they're like, the drought's over. And the experts were like, well, no, California's actually sunk an average of 7 feet over the last couple decades because the aquifers have been drained and the ground has been slowly compacting over the years. So they've lost a ton of their storage capacity for water. So now when they do have rains, there's no aquifers to refill. They can't store as much water. They have a lot more flooding issues. So I'm always interested in groundwater recharge projects. I'm glad they're looking at that. I mentioned the wind retrofit, and they have like safe rooms. I didn't put those up here because we don't really qualify for those here, but tornado prone areas, they get safe rooms, and they're for residences. And Fix the Bricks is kind of our answer to the residential applicant program where, they're retrofitting residences and stuff. There are some projects that we get that come up where FEMA's emphasizing the public-private partnership. So there's some like subdivisions that are being built or they know they're expanding, so they're wanting to put debris basins or retention ponds in to protect them because they're being built up along the canyon edges. And those are great, but then there's others where we look at it and the codes and code enforcement or the cities, they're requiring the contractor to do certain things in order to build there because they know that it floods or it does stuff. And a lot of that, the answer might not be, well, let's get money from FEMA so the contractor doesn't have to pay for it. It might just be that's part of your new, if you want to build in an area we know that floods, you have to build it in a way that addresses the flooding. So grants are great, but as Brad's mentioned before, code enforcement, putting in new things, preventing stuff in the first place is a good way to go. So there's a few new things that have come out, types of projects or types of grants you can apply for. I'll briefly go over the FMA. As we mentioned, we don't always qualify for FMA, and then there's a few in PDM. So advanced assistance. So this is one that's new to PDM, but has been updated in FMA. Advanced assistant is basically, it's money for you to do studies, gather data, and develop strategies for mitigation projects. So it's not to do your plan. You have your plan, but maybe your plan strategy was pretty vague, or you know you need to address certain issues, but you need to get the information and the data in to make the best choices about what way to approach it, what areas should be addressed first. So this is funding that you can get for that. In the FMA, there's no limit to the number of sub-applications. So that means when we put these grants in, FEMA gives us limits to the number of grants we can submit. We can only submit, I think, up to 9 competitive PDM ones. We can only submit 1 of this kind. We can only submit 3 of this kind. And so this category in FMA, there's no limits. You can put in as many as you want to. And they're not to exceed $100,000 in federal share. So that's the maximum amount you can ask for that. And then they also changed their projects. The category is community flood mitigation. So they've changed it for a community-wide. So they've allowed the advanced assistance, and they've allowed community-wide flood mitigation projects. So this addresses kind of a community area. And it addresses the risk for the purpose of reducing NFIP flood claims. Well, we don't really have NFIP flood claims here. So this one will be quite hard for us to apply for. If you think you have some, let us know. But that's up to a $10 million federal share. I think in FMA they have a certain amount set aside for that, and they choose the highest ranked. So they have ways they rank the applicants at the federal level, and then it's the highest ones that rank within there that are chosen for the amount of money they have. And then this is how FMA prioritizes their grants. So their first priority is the Community Flood Mitigation Advanced Assistance. So that's the first one they're going to fund. Then they're going to fund the projects under that, which were the 2 we just spoke about. Then they also have technical assistant grants that they provide, as well as flood mitigation planning, and then their competitive funding for properties or for flood mitigation projects. So this is their ordering rank of what they will fund first, and then, as we mentioned, it just depends on how much money they have left by the time they get to the bottom. But this is a bit more what Brad spoke about earlier, a little bit more of an explanation. So in order to qualify and meet the severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss, so the 50% of the structures involved 50% of the structures involved in the project area have to have at least 2 NFIP claims that exceed the market value of the home. That's a severe repetitive loss. So it has to be completely destroyed. Like, your damage has to be more than what your market value of your home is. And that has to have happened at least twice, and it has to be NFIP claims. Repetitive loss is 2 that exceed 25% of the market value, and then severe repetitive loss with 4 or more claims that exceed $5,000 apiece. We don't really have those numbers. We don't have many NFIP policies here, and we don't have many people that make claims on those policies. All right, so this is the one we really want to get into. So new for 2018, some new project categories that they're incorporating. So advanced assistance, which was available for FMA before but not PDM, is now available in PDM. As I mentioned, it's kind of a project scoping is what they labeled it as one of the sections. It's, you have your plan, you know what you need to do, but you need to get data, you need to be more informed. So you can get money to develop these projects to apply for a grant in the future. So you can get the money this year, do your study, and then in a year or 2, apply for a project that has come out of this advanced assistance scoping. But they want to emphasize, just because you get the scoping or the advanced assistance money does not guarantee that you are going to get the money for your project. So they're not connected. You have to still go through the competitive process for whatever project comes out of this. And then resilient infrastructure. So we as the state are allowed to submit 1 resilient infrastructure project this year. It can be up to $10 million federal share. So it can be quite an expensive project. There is an evaluation criteria for this, though, and this is where we talk about code enforcement and the other things. This is where it makes or breaks if you're eligible for some of these projects. So this also gets an extra year on their period of performance. Most, as Brad mentioned, period of performance, that's how long you have to finish your construction or to finish your plan, is 36 months from the date that FEMA notifies us of what projects they're looking at selecting. The resilient infrastructure project gets an extra year. They get 48 months to finish that construction. All right, resilient infrastructure. These are eligible activities, included but not limited to a lot of the standard ones that we do, but it focuses on infrastructure. So, your general utilities, water and sanitary sewer systems, flood control measures to protect facilities, flood storage and diversion, floodplain and stream restoration, stormwater management, aquifer storage, and aquifer recovery are part of this. If we have any communities that can meet the qualifications and really wants to get some of this done, if you can't apply this year, hopefully they still have the category next year that you can look into. And then wetland restoration and creation. And I think my brain is trying to rack all the things I have to know about all the different grant programs. I can't remember if it's within FMA or if it's within this program. I think it was FMA. One of them has a restriction that it has to be within a certain watershed area, but I think that was some of the FMA grants, because I would have put it on here, I think, if it was part of the infrastructure one. All right, these are the priorities and the points you get. This is how are they going to prioritize you for getting that. We can submit one per state. So they're going to rank all 50 applicants on this criteria. So we're competing with a project from every other state, and we want to be ranked high. So this is their ranking system. Private partnership cost share. They're really trying to emphasize that. So if you can do your project with a private partner, be it a developer, be it a private utility company, a lot of our utilities in Utah are private, they're not public, but if you can partner with them, and I think a lot of that is they know they can help with the match, they have a lot of resources, they're really wanting to emphasize those. That gives you 150 points. So, IBC adopted 2009 or newer. So you have to be, it says IBC adoption epitomizes community commitment to responsible building regulations. Points to the IBC participating communities with a 2009 version or higher adopted. Our state tends to make a lot of exceptions to a lot of the federal rules and regulations, which they're allowed to do. They're allowed to put things in there. But your community has to have that 2009 or newer IBC code, and you have to be enforcing it in order to get the full points for that. A lot of exceptions that reduce the regulations, it's great if you have more that make them stronger, but if you have a lot of exceptions reducing those regulations or disregarding some of them, then you're not going to score very high in this area of evaluation. And then I'm not as familiar with some of these others. Those who work in building and engineering might know some of these rating systems. But the building code effectiveness grading schedule, you have to meet a certain number of points. Sorry, it's really small to fit it on here, but they have different rankings depending on what your score is in that rating system and how many points you'll receive. Community rating system. This has to do with our NFIP and flood stuff. They have a rating system. I don't know, Eric, do you remember if we have a lot of CRS participating communities? And
We have under 10.
Yeah.
It fluctuates. I think it's about 8 right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then by May it will be 9.
Yeah. So community rating system is pretty stringent. They've gotten more strict, like most of these programs have over the years, where you really have to, your mitigation plan has to be good. It has to not just meet FEMA approval, but have all these wonderful extra things in there that are good strategies for fighting flood mitigation. And so we have just a few communities that actually are, even have a CRS score. Yeah. And then Firewise USA. I know we have a minimal number of Firewise communities. Most of them are little subdivisions or HOAs. They're not the entire town. As well as the Cooperating Technical Partner Program, or CTP. I think, is Jamie our only CTP person in the entire state? So do the communities, because she's a state level, do they fall under her, or they have to have their own? Okay. So if you are the lucky community that actually has most of these, or at least the higher ranked ones in there, I'm not saying don't apply if you maybe are not a Firewise community, because that's 25 points, but we are going to be ranked against all 50 other states. So these are some things that we really want to emphasize: code enforcement, being involved in these programs, making sure your community is doing these things, because then, you know, that $10 million to do a really good project. But it is competitive, and it is based on these score points. So the first priority is the state and tribal set aside. As Brad mentioned, we at the state are pretty much guaranteed $575,000. The tribal ones were up to 10 million total, but I think they were 575 for each project as well. Then it breaks up different ways within the tribal application, so we can look into more detail with that if you need to. But we can pretty much guarantee whatever, we prioritize a project for that amount, and then we should get at least that much awarded. Advance assistance is the next highest priority, so 200,000. It's the highest ranked eligible sub-applicants from each applicant can qualify for that, and that's the ranking system. It's not that infrastructure ranking system. It's just the standard PDM, if they think your project's a good project, if it meets all the requirements, if you're an eligible entity. And then the resilient infrastructure comes next. We only have one that we can submit for that. And then traditional competitive. So this is where, once you don't fall into any of those special categories, these are the ones that fall into a lump category. You'll be competing against each other and then nationwide for everyone else who wants the money. So multi-state or tribal initiatives, we as the state can put in a multi-state if we want to partner with a neighboring state to a project. I don't think we have any of those lined up. I'm not sure with the tribal if it's multi-tribal or if it is the state partnering with the tribe on something. We'll have to do some more research into that. And then planning sub-applications, they usually get awarded. They want everyone to have a plan. And then after that, the funding that's left over goes to the projects. So the priorities they're putting in here is reducing risk to any natural hazard. I'm like, that's kind of pretty vague, but that's the priority that they put in there. And then planning and then generators for critical facilities that are identified in a FEMA approved mitigation plan. So if you want a standalone generator project, they want you to have it tied into your mitigation plan and show that it is there. And then further priorities after those are small impoverished communities, public-private partnerships, and validated BCR BCAs. They do mention climate change, addressing those issues in there as well. So that's something that they'll look at. We send in our priorities. Sometimes FEMA doesn't always select the ones that we choose. Sometimes our number one project doesn't get chosen and they choose number 10. We don't always know why. Because it's a competitive grant, FEMA does not give us feedback on why they did or did not choose a project. They will just tell us it was ineligible